Thank you again for meeting with me. I really do appreciate it. It's always an honor to speak with one of the greatest thinkers of the modern era, so I sincerely do appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
It's likely that the key story that will define the Trump presidency is the so-called RussiaGate accusations. I know that you previously stated that these claims were something of a joke and that Trump himself is largely a distraction. But could you please clarify if you think Russia did anything devious, if leaking the DNC emails are really even a crime, or if you believe Russia did collude with Trump, but that the story has been manipulated by the mainstream media to create sort of a neo-McCarthyist Red Scare?
I presume that Russia had an interest in the outcome of the election and probably tried to influence it. I don't consider that a major issue. For one thing, if you want to consider interventions in the elections, there are vastly greater ones. So, for example, it's well established by very solid empirical work by academic political scientists. Thomas Ferguson is the major one, that American elections are, in a certain sense, bought, in the sense that you can predict the outcome of an election with extreme precision simply by looking at the single variable of campaign funding. And in fact, Ferguson did a very close, careful analysis of the 2016 election, which verified this hypothesis in a way that most people aren't aware of. He looked closely at the way campaign funding worked, and it turned out in the last stages of the campaign, when the big investors and capitalist interests were beginning to be afraid that they didn't like Trump, but they were afraid that there might be a moderately liberal Democrat, they poured money in a very targeted way, not just to the presidents, but to the Senate and House elections, and that led to a change which is reflected in the vote. So that's real manipulation of elections, massive manipulation. If the Russians did something minor, maybe. Furthermore, manipulation of elections by external powers is pretty normal. The United States, in fact, is the champion in that regard. We not only intervene in elections, we overthrow governments if we don't like them, things like that. In fact, if you want to look at manipulation of elections recently, the most striking example, which to my knowledge has only been reported in the business press, Bloomberg Business Week, is the last German elections a couple months ago. There was a very surprise, everyone was surprised by the rise in votes gained by the more or less neo-fascist party, Alternative for Deutschland. Turns out that there was a campaign organized by a Texas media company that works for Trump, Le Pen, Netanyahu, others. They collaborated with the Berlin Facebook office, which provided them with a detailed demographic analysis of voters in Germany, and they were able to micro-target election-based ads to these individuals in a way which seems to have had a fairly significant influence on the rise of the neo-fascist party. That's a detectable case. Others may exist or may not, but they're all in fact, the U.S. not only intervenes, but in elections, let's say in Russia, for example, but is very proud of it. So Clinton massively intervened in the, I think it was 1996 elections, in which Yeltsin, his favorite, was elected, and it was considered a great triumph. It wasn't hidden. So maybe the Russians tried to do something. There's no indication that it had much effect, but it doesn't seem to me a significant issue. I think it's picked up by the Democrats and by the liberal press because they hate Trump, of course, and are trying to find some way to undermine him. Democrats are seeking an excuse for why they lost an election, which should have been an open shut affair if they'd ran a decent campaign and had decent programs.
Well, what's interesting is if you actually look back to the 2012 election, President Obama was very critical of Mitt Romney's position on Russia and was saying that it was a Cold War era position, and it was very critical. I believe he even said at one point the 1980s called.
Because a few months ago, when you were asked what's the biggest geopolitical threat facing America, you said Russia. Not Al-Qaeda, you said Russia. In the 1980s are now calling to ask for their foreign policy back because the Cold War has been over for 20 years. But, Governor, when it comes to our foreign policy, you seem to want to import the foreign policies of the 1980s. You indicated that we shouldn't be passing nuclear treaties with Russia, despite the fact that 71 senators, Democrats and Republicans, voted for it.
The statements that Governor Romney makes show little understanding of what is actually going on in the 21st century.
This is to Russia. This is, without question, our number one geopolitical foe.
It's a really curious statement, given that the Cold War has been over for some time.
He is not up to date, and that is a very dangerous aspect. That's just an example of his 20th century approach to 21st century issues.
He's even blurted out the preposterous notion that Russia is our number one geopolitical foe. Folks, Sarah Palin said she could see Russia from Alaska. Mitt Romney talks like he's only seen Russia by watching Rocky IV. I tell you.
We have a lot of problems that are not leftovers from the past, but are of the moment. We've just been talking about one, namely Iran. And in many of the areas where we are working to solve problems, Russia has been an ally. They're in the P5+1 talks with us. They have worked with us in Afghanistan and have been very helpful in the Northern Distribution Network and in other ways. So I think it's somewhat dated to be looking backwards instead of being realistic about where we agree, where we don't agree, but looking for ways to bridge the disagreements and then to maximize the cooperation.
What do you think it was that caused the Democrats to suddenly become such hawks against Russia? Was it what happened with Ukraine, or was there something maybe else that has caused this new wave again of, it seems like a second Cold War almost?
Well, the roots are pretty deep. It's you have to look back to the collapse of the Soviet system if we want to understand what's happening. In around 1990, the Berlin Wall fell, the Soviet Union collapsed. The question is, what's going to happen next? And there were two quite different visions. Mikhail Gorbachev, speaking for the former Soviet Union, advanced the idea of what he called a common European home. There should be a single, broader European home, including Western Europe, including Russia, eliminate all military alliances, have a common security system, and work towards a common integrated future. The U.S. wasn't having any of that. George Bush, the first, and his Secretary of State, James Baker, had their proposal, what they wanted, and what Gorbachev agreed to, was a unified Germany that would become part of NATO. And for Gorbachev to agree with that is a pretty substantial concession. After all, Russia had practically been destroyed twice in the century by Germany alone. Germany as part of a hostile military alliance is a little bit frightening from a Russian point of view, but he agreed. And there was a quid pro quo. The quid pro quo was that NATO would not move, the phrase was, 1 inch to the east. By that they meant East Berlin, East Germany. Nobody was talking about anything beyond. That was never in writing, and it was a gentleman's agreement. And when the U.S. very quickly moved NATO into East Germany, they argued, Bush and Baker argued, that there was only a verbal discussion, never an official commitment. We can debate that. But what next happened under Clinton is that NATO expanded all the way to the Russian border. from the Russian point of view, which we should try to understand, that's the traditional invasion route through which Russia has been repeatedly invaded and virtually destroyed, now all part of a hostile military alliance. The U.S. went on, including under Obama, to place George Bush II had withdrawn from the anti-ballistic ABM treaty, ballistic missile treaty. It's well understood that missile defense, what's called missile defense, is in effect a first strike weapon. And nobody believes that any conceivable missile defense would ever stop a first strike. Conceivably, it might stop a retaliatory strike, which makes it, in effect, a first strike weapon. And these are being placed right near the Russian border. They also have, the claim is their defense against Iran, but it's not even laughable.
Right.
It was pointed out right at the time, the beginning of the expansion by George Kennan and other statesmen, that expanding to the Russian border was an error of a tragic error of historical significance. It virtually guaranteed tension and conflict at the border, which is extremely dangerous. And of course that's taken place. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, the Russian economy was subjected to a rapid marketization, shock therapy it was called, which devastated the economy in the 90s. The economy just almost total collapsed. Millions of people died. It was a monstrosity from the point of view of the Russian population. And there was a reaction. Putin came in and restored a kind of nationalist effort to restore Russia's place in the world, its power, and rebuild its economy, and so on. All of this led to an inevitable conflict. The Obama administration at first tried to, what they called, reset relations with Russia to be more amicable, but that broke down under disagreements over a series of issues. Ukraine, which you mentioned, was one. There were others, and policy reversed. Clinton herself was pretty much a hawk on Russia, but now the situation's mixed. There's interactions on Syria, there's threatening conflicts, and there is what's often called a new Cold War.
So another thing that's pretty remarkable about the Trump administration and about his campaigning is that he largely ran against the corporate media. He obviously has called them fake news many times, and at some points in his campaigning, he also even took dovish approaches. He was seemingly criticizing Hillary Clinton from the left on Iraq, for example.
Well,
and
that was a joke. He supported the Iraq War. After it turned into a disaster, everyone became a late opponent of the war.
Mm-hmm. Well, what I was going to ask you about is generally the relationship between the media and Trump, because another thing that's kind of funny is that the media, although they're very critical of Trump, when he does something like bomb Syria, that's when they seem to celebrate him. And some of the criticism, even, for example, from Rachel Maddow, has been that in regards to North Korea, he's being too soft on North Korea recently. So just what is your overall take on this, at least supposed rivalry between Donald Trump and the corporate media?
First of all, it's not true. Donald Trump had enormous support from the corporate media. Fox News is the most watched cable news program. There's no other media outlet that is so openly and fanatically politicized. They barely, others try to be more or less neutral, whether they succeed or not, but Fox doesn't even try. Apart from that, there's the radio system, talk radio, which has been taken over by the far right, reaches huge numbers of people. That's and again, it's so extreme you can barely describe it. Mm. So that's huge media support. Trump had enormous corporate support, plenty of funding. His campaign ran $1 billion or so, enormous media support, and what he was he's a canny politician. He understood very well that a good part of the population is extremely disillusioned, angry, frightened, doesn't like what's happening. This is happening all over the world, incidentally. Same in Europe. You take a look at the last Italian election,
Right.
Practically every European election, the main kind of centrist parties, center left, center right, are being virtually destroyed. There's anger, fear, contempt for institutions, looking for something else. And the reasons are not that obscure. Starting roughly in 1980, general social and economic policy shifted towards what's called neoliberalism, which is designed in ways which lead to sharp concentration of wealth, stagnation or decline for much of the population. So real wages in the United States are roughly what they were in the 1960s. Productivity has increased, but it's not going to labor, it's going to capital. There is growth, but very few hands. Meanwhile, the public services decline, as wealth concentrates, that means that its power over government concentrates almost automatically by many means, lobbying, all sorts of ways that are familiar. So the government becomes less and less responsive to popular interests. You find, in effect, a decline in functioning democracy. Well, all of these phenomena do lead to extreme discontent and hatred of establishment institutions. And Trump was able to capitalize on that. Pretended, total pretense, of course, to be working for the, ordinary common man. Meanwhile, he's shafting them in every possible way, but gaining their popular support by catering to their often pretty legitimate grievances, claiming. But meanwhile, in fact, what's actually happening in the Trump administration, whether by design or by accident, is a kind of a two-tiered program. Trump gets the media to focus on him. And in fact, that's his basically one doctrine,
Right.
Everything follows from that. So he does one crazy thing after another. The media focus on it. They spend time criticizing it. A couple days later, they expose the lies. Meanwhile, he's on to something else.
Right.
Now, all of this appeals to his base and leads to the picture of the media sort of picking on the guy who's speaking for us. And while he's doing that, and the media are kind of cooperating by the way they focus on this, while he's doing that, the really savage wing of the Republican Party, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell, those guys are ramming through legislation which is extremely harmful, not only to the general population, but to the world at large. And that's kind of in the corner. So the media do not focus on the major issues in the Trump administration. The most significant one by far, it overwhelms everything else, is the race of the Republican Party towards destruction of an environment in which organized human life can survive. That's not a small fact. These are imminent problems, this generation or the next, and deep problems. It's kind of astounding that the most powerful country in world history has departed openly and publicly from the international effort to at least try to do something about the problem. And beyond that is racing to try to increase the destruction. And the equally astounding fact is that this isn't a headline every day. In fact, it's not just the United States, although the U.S. is in the lead. Or take, say, the one Republican achievement that they're proud of, the tax bill. It's a total giveaway to the rich and the corporate sector. It's not going to help anyone else. But if you appeal to the anger, and of course a large part of the Trump support is evangelical churches, so you give them whatever they want, chance to be politicized, Supreme Court justice, then you can keep the base in line, while meanwhile serving your actual constituency, which is the rich and corporate power, and shafting everyone else. It's a workable program. So far, he's succeeded. I have to give him credit for it.
So I did mention Syria. Trump did, of course, bomb Syria again this year, like he did almost 1 year to the day prior. And both of those bombings were predicated on the accusation that Assad used chemical weapons against, quote, his own people. Do you believe that those gas attacks took place or that they were carried out by the Assad regime?
I think the weight of evidence suggests that they were probably carried out by the Assad regime, but fact is we don't have really strong evidence, overwhelming evidence. If I had to make a guess, I'd say yes, that's what happened. And in fact, you can even think of reasons for it. But the bombing was a purely symbolic act. First of all, they didn't know it, so they didn't have strong evidence for it. Secondly, it was pretty plainly coordinated with the Russians so that there wouldn't be any conflict. They bombed targets that didn't seem of any significance. One of them may have been, in fact, a medical facility. And it was a one-shot affair, mainly for the usual reasons, to fire up the base, gain some support, look as if you're tough, doing something different from Obama. Those are the main criteria. It doesn't matter what the consequences are.
A lot of folks out there have denied that Assad carried out that attack, and that position has been labeled a conspiracy theory. And I just want to talk with you about this term for a minute, because I know that it's a somewhat complicated term because a lot of things can be labeled a conspiracy theory. There are conspiracies that are happening by the wealthy and powerful. There are conspiracy theories that the media itself pushes, like the Russia collusion. And then, there are insane conspiracy theories about a reptilian Illuminati. When you hear this term conspiracy theory, are there any conspiracy theories that you believe might have been purposely delegitimized, things that might have actually happened, such as if the assassination of John F. Kennedy, RFK, MLK, if any of those assassinations were carried out by the U.S. government? Just overall, are there any quote-unquote conspiracy theories that you think might actually be legitimate?
Oh, there are conspiracies all the time. Go back to Adam Smith, iconic figure. He pointed out, he wrote, in fact, in his famous book, Wealth of Nations, that if you see a few businessmen talking to each other privately, they're probably engaged in a conspiracy against the public. That's the normal kind of conspiracy, when those in power get together to try to achieve their gains, often in secret. Sometimes you find out about it later. So that happens all the time. That's normal life. The term conspiracy theory is used to refer to ideas that the speaker wants to delegitimate, maybe correctly, maybe not correctly. But you just have to take a look at any one of these proposals on its face and forget the name and ask, is it plausible? Is it pointing to something? Is it discovering something?
Well, for instance, I think that the most popular or most widely received conspiracy theories would be that the U.S. government took part in the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK. Do you think that any of those three instances that might actually be the case?
I think it's conceivable in the Martin Luther King case. Maybe not the government, but some element in the government might have had a role in that. In the John F. Kennedy case, it's extremely unlikely. There's a lot of confusion about this. I've written about it. I don't take any stand on who killed John F. Kennedy, maybe the mafia, maybe somebody else. But I think the evidence is overwhelming that it was not a high-level conspiracy with policy consequences. That much we can check by looking at the evidence. What were the policy positions of Kennedy? How were they changed? And the answer is essentially none. A lot of it focuses on a completely misinterpreted national security memorandum, NSM 273, in which Kennedy agreed rather reluctantly with a proposal from McNamara that troops should be withdrawn from Vietnam in another year or so. But what's overlooked is that he added after victory. He insisted that it be after victory. It looked at the time as if the U.S. might have succeeded in its goal of establishing a client regime in South Vietnam looked optimistic at the time. And so he said, well, if that's true, okay, then we don't need troops anymore. But that's not a dovish position. Shortly after the assassination, in fact, if he had been interested in withdrawing, there was a perfect opportunity for it just shortly before. In August 1963, the government discovered that the Diem brothers, running South Vietnam, running the client state, were negotiating with the North to try to settle on some peaceful negotiated settlement which would end the war. If Kennedy had been interested in withdrawing, that was a perfect opportunity. Could have taken credit for it, saying, okay, we have peace, war's over, let's come home. What did they do? They decided to overthrow the government and install a super hawkish general. That's shortly before, that's right at the same time. And until the end, he remained one of the more hawkish parts of the government. And if you look at the other cases, I think the same collapses. In the Robert Kennedy case, I think there's questions about what happened, but I don't know of any evidence that the government might have been involved. The King case is somewhat different.
Another range of conspiracy theories has to do with central banking and how the Federal Reserve, for example, was established on Jekyll Island when a bunch of wealthy bankers met. I know that you in the past have said that a central bank is necessary in our current economic system or current world, but it seems that a lot of monetary theorists trace back most of our social ills to central banks. Thomas Greco, for example, has highlighted how tight monetary policies lead to artificial scarcity and the cancerous, consumptive nature of the global financial system. So shouldn't it really be in the forefront of a popular movement to also take on monetary policies and oppose the current central banks that we have and maybe create local currencies like the E.F. Schumacher Institute does with Bay Bucks, or maybe even something more radical than that?
Well, if you want to talk about a radical change in the economic system, there's all sorts of possibilities. You could have community-based banking systems. You could have control of the total financial system, but that means overthrowing capitalism. We're not talking about small things here. If you're going to have anything like the kind of state capitalist system that prevails in the United States, Europe, to varying degrees the rest of the world, then it just won't be managed without a central banking system. It's not a conspiracy, you know.
So what are your thoughts on Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies?
I mean, the background system, the blockchain system, is probably a usable system, but I'd be very surprised if Bitcoin really survives as a major part of the economy. Maybe.
Well, it's really been pushed by right-wing libertarians, and this is something else I'd like to ask you about because, you know, that's another group that really opposes the Federal Reserve. I know that you said that right-wing libertarianism is essentially barbaric and would lead to private concentrations of power. But what I wonder often is, in a truly free society, wouldn't there be different economic systems in different places? And wouldn't some people be allowed voluntarily to have what some might call anarcho-capitalism?
Sure. If certain people, for example, decide we want to be slaves, I don't think they should be stopped. I don't expect it to happen if the options are available, but I wouldn't like to see a society in which the force, the concentrated force, including military force, blocks a group of people who say we want to be slaves of some master. And if people say we want to rent ourselves to somebody, which is temporary slavery, as classical liberals described it, I don't think that should be barred. But I think that better options can be provided, which people will accept.
Well, I did actually have a question for you from a right-wing libertarian, Walter Block. I don't know if you maybe have heard of his name before. He's involved with the Mises Institute. He's also an eminent scholar and endowed chair and professor of economics at Loyola. And I just wanted to read you a question that he has. Again, these aren't my words.
Sure.
They're not very delicate, so I don't mean to be insulting. I'm just reading what he wrote.
That's fine.
He says, "You lefties favor sexual and other acts between consenting adults. why not also capitalist acts between consenting adults, like hiring someone for $6 an hour less than the minimum wage? You think that's exploitative, but if the worker agrees, that's the best opportunity that he sees for himself. Ditto sweatshop labor, ditto using money. You call yourself an anarchist, and yet would have the government prohibit by law these things.
First of all, consent is a very curious notion. It's well understood all the way back in the tradition of classical liberalism, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, others, that hiring yourself, that renting yourself to someone essentially is temporary slavery. Now, do you consent to that? Well, if the choice is starving, yes, probably you consent to it. But that's a curious kind of consent. You have to look at the conditions under which people make agreements. If there's an enormous disparity of power between the owner and the person renting himself, and under those conditions, to talk about consent is a joke. It's like saying, if I'm holding a big club and you're over there, and I say, I want you to lie down on the floor, and your choice is either I'll lie down on the floor or I'll have my head smashed by a club. Yeah, you consented to lie down on the floor, but do we take that seriously?
It's also just worth mentioning that Dr. Block asked for the opportunity to debate you. He's even said that he would come here to Arizona. I just was interested, would you possibly debate him if you wanted to come out here?
Possibly. I don't particularly. The concept of debate, first of all, is one of the most irrational inventions that human beings have come up with. Just think about what a debate is. The ground rules for a debate are you're not allowed to change your mind. You're not allowed to say to the person you're talking to, oh, that was an interesting idea, why don't we pursue it? It's just the height of irrationality. I mean, I sometimes participate in them if there's some point to doing it, but I think it's a totally ridiculous notion. Suppose we have a graduate seminar in the sciences. Is it set up as a debate? Or do we do an interchange in which people have proposals and they discuss them, and if somebody else has an idea and you think makes some sense, you pursue it, and so on? That's what a sane, rational interchange among grown-up human beings should be. Not, here's my position, there's your position, I stick to it no matter what. I mean, it's a game, if you like a football game. Maybe it's fun for people to play, but it's not a rational interchange. So as I say, I sometimes agree to participate while recognizing that it's the height of irrationality.
So I know that you previously have spoken in favor of gun control. There are other left-wing theorists who seem to be against it, or at least at times have written against it. For example, Kevin Carson with the Center for a Stateless Society. A few years back, he wrote an article showing that in the past, gun control has often been used by the ruling elite who control government against the working class, for instance, with the Black Panther Party. So shouldn't we oppose the state either under its current model or even under a benevolent sort of state socialism? Shouldn't we oppose that sort of ruling elite disarming the working class?
Hey everyone, there is more to this interview with Noam Chomsky on PRIMO NUTMEG. It's a really interesting and thought-provoking discussion, and to get access to that, all you have to do is become a patron for $1 a month at patreon.com/PRIMO NUTMEG. For that $1 a month, you'll not only get access to the rest of this interview with Noam Chomsky, you'll also get access to exclusive segments from other interviews. You'll also get access to hours and hours of forgotten content from PRIMO NUTMEG's earlier seasons, including some of my most controversial shows like my interview with former US Congresswoman Cynthia McKinney. And most importantly, you'll be helping to support a truly independent media outlet, one that provides exclusive interviews with the likes of not only Noam Chomsky, but Jill Stein, Ralph Nader, Matt Taibbi, and so many others. So everyone, please do hop over to patreon.com/PRIMO NUTMEG and become a patron for just $1 a month. Also, folks, when you have a spare second, remember to subscribe to PRIMO NUTMEG on YouTube, like PRIMO NUTMEG on Facebook, and follow PRIMO NUTMEG on Instagram and Twitter. Thanks again, folks, and I'll catch you for the rest of this interview at patreon.com/PRIMO NUTMEG.